This week's Torah portion is Parshas Mishpatim, but it's not just Parshas Mishpatim, it's also Shabbos Mevorchim Chidish Adar, which means to say it's the Shabbos that comes to bless the month of Adar, and Adar is the month that contains in it the holiday, the Yom Tov, the great day of Purim. And we'd say that Mishenichnas Adar Marvin Besimcha, that when the time of Adar starts, we're supposed to increase in joy. Meaning to say, we're supposed to be joyous the entire year. Ivdos Hashem b'simcha, we should be serving God Almighty with joy all the time. When it comes to Adar, we're meant to start increasing that to the pinnacle, the height of joy on the day of Purim, and it should increase even after that, to continue just that you thought you got to the highest, happiest point. Now you got to go even higher and happier. So it's interesting, Navy SEALs has an expression that says that when a person feels that they're completely finished, they can't go any longer, they're completely done, they really only reach 10% of their capabilities. And the Baal Shem Tov says that we can learn a lesson in the service of God Almighty from everything we see and hear. So too, in the service of God Almighty, when we feel we've come to the greatest point of joy, we've come to the greatest point of clarity, we've come to the greatest point of tranquility, we're not even 10% there of what we're really capable of. We should use that as a springboard to increase in our joy, increase in our clarity, and increase our tranquility. And all that leads to increase in loving kindness, increase of positive, loving feelings towards our Creator, towards ourselves, and towards every single human being, to spread the hope, to spread the joy, and to let every single human being know that the joyous realization that there's a loving Creator, loving God Almighty that's creating each one of us at every instant in His divine image. And as part of that incredible joyous life that we have, He creates for us a framework for success. And the framework for success is to follow His guidance, which we are able to intuit. A person is able, even if he never learned a word of Torah, even if he never heard about the revelation of God Almighty's revelation on Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah and the giving of the commandments, the 613 commandments that apply to the Jewish people, and the 7 commandments that apply to all the human beings of the world, which include 30 commandments and many, many more details of commandments and loving guidance from God Almighty. Even if a person didn't know about that, he is still obligated and able to intuit and to be able to come to discern from looking at the world what it is God Almighty's message and direction for him. So we have access to this, and we have access to it in a very real way. We have both the teachings from generations to generations of the Torah, but we also have our internal spiritual compass, our internal spiritual guide that is already oriented in the correct direction. And the divine revelation of Mount Sinai and the giving of the commandments and the loving divine framework by God Almighty matches exactly what we already know to be true and what we already have inside of us as that divine guidance. So it's essential for us to remember that every one of those points of contact with God Almighty, every one of those points with our contact with our Creator, every one of those points of loving and proper contact with our fellow man is guided by that divine creative guidance, that divine instruction for each one of us. And we must see that every one of those points of contact is really under the same divine guidance and the same divine instruction. We don't say, oh, this is a holy law on one hand, and then we have other mundane laws. Like, for example, making sure that we are going to take care of our responsibilities in financial matters, and if we damage someone else's property. No, that is an expression of following God Almighty's divine guidance and loving instructions in every single situation. So when a person comes and he hits someone else's car, then his obligation is as a divine obligation. It's not derived from a human law. It's not derived from a human instruction. It's not because of fear of repercussions, but rather it's because he knows that God Almighty is giving him a loving instruction that now that you are in this situation, the right thing to do is going to bring you to the greatest advancement of your purpose and cause here in this world, carrying the divine image into every situation, into every place. So this is what Parshas Mishpatim is about, because Parshas Mishpatim is following right on to the giving of the Torah, this incredible event of revelation of God Almighty to all of humanity. Now the Torah is giving us details of the actual practical implication of the details of our life, how to treat other people, how to live the life of a mensch, of a proper man, how to live the life of a chassid, a person who's going above and beyond the call of the hour, above and beyond to do kindness to his creator and to his fellow man. That involves in making sure that we are not damaging other people, to make sure that we are taking care of our responsibilities, make sure that we don't damage other people in word, in action, and even in thought, to make sure that our thoughts are focused on the positive in other people. As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, if a negative thought comes into your mind about another person, you should immediately replace it with a positive thought about that person. Rather than justifying to yourself why it is that you're justified in thinking these negative thoughts according to your limited understanding and fact collection systems, that you think you know the facts about this person and you're entitled to reach a judgment. On the contrary, replace it with a positive thought. Look at that person the same way that God Almighty looks at that person. That is our responsibility. And to know that when we're thinking a negative thought about another person, it's really a reflection of our own insecurity. Because if we were to truly be secure in knowing that there's nothing besides God Almighty, we would not, and that we are one with that oneness of God Almighty, then, and the other person is, we would not have any space to even possibly contemplate a negative thought about that other person. So it only comes from our lack of real grounding in the reality that there's nothing besides God Almighty, that it even comes to our mind to entertain and ruminate on the thought of the negativity of another person. So we could see that the Torah is telling us, it's liberating us from the imprisonment of our own thinking, of our own speech and our own actions and the consequences of them, by lovingly guiding us that God Almighty wants us to choose the positive thoughts, to choose the thoughts of goodness, to choose the thoughts that are divine thoughts. And that will lead to divinely inspired speech, speeches of encouragement, speech of loving kindness, speech and communication pointing other people to your own insights and realizations of God Almighty in your life. And that will lead to acts of loving kindness. That will lead to acts of justice, to acts of taking responsibility, taking care, responsibility for your actions, and serving when necessary as a proper participant in bringing justice into the world. That if it's necessary for you to serve as a judge, it's necessary for you to serve as a witness. If it's necessary for you to serve as a party in a court of law that's coming to a proper court of law that's coming to establish what the truth is according to God Almighty's standards of how we are supposed to arrive at what is the system of liability and the proper system of coming to a judgment, the proper system of pursuing the truth. That is our divine responsibility. So Parshas Mishpatim is bringing us to this realization that every detail of our life is guided lovingly by God Almighty with clear instructions for us to really harness our life energy into a positive, constructive direction that will bring more life into the world and create the infrastructure and the framework for more and more human life with joy. And that's why Adar is a time of great joy, that the ultimate expression of joy is the joyousness of life, being alive, to bring more children into the world, to joyously help other people bring more children into the world, to welcome every single human being. Because when you are in this state of mind, recognizing that there's nothing besides God Almighty, you know that there's enough for everybody. You have no doubt whatsoever. And if you have whatever you think you have, you know you'll share with everybody, and God Almighty will provide even more, because that is the feeling of expansiveness and love and the certainty of God Almighty's abundance that comes from knowing that there's nothing besides God Almighty. So on the contrary, instead of being negative and trying to figure out ways to preserve what you have and prevent other people from coming into existence to share it, rather the answer to the prosperity, the prosperous way of thinking, the way of abundance of God Almighty is whatever I have, I'm willing to share with as many of these people as possible. And that means all the resources in the world, are meant to be shared with more and more people, and the resources will increase in ways of abundance that we're not even able to possibly foresee. And every single human being will be welcomed into the world because we will recognize that they are going to contribute a divine image into the world that's going to bring the well springs. They themselves will become a well springs of God Almighty's divine wisdom in the world, that we are all incomplete without them. So right now, with 8 billion people, we only have a fraction of the divine presence in the world, with the divine image in the world of what's really intended. And the world is obviously going to be able to not only sustain these people, God Almighty is the one that's sustaining them. They will flourish. More and more people will flourish with more and more contribution to divine wisdom, and more contribution to greater insights into divine wisdom, and more contributions into insights in how to provide more and more resources and make available and unleash and harness more and more resources in the created world, so that people are more and more freed up to spend their entire time in just learning the divine wisdom and having and experiencing the insights into the divine wisdom to share with themselves, with their families, with other people, until the entire world's sole occupation is going to be to know God Almighty. And this is the joy that we have with the eager anticipation of the realization of this, that this abundance exists, and this abundance will become even more apparent. And the ultimate abundance is the abundance of people in the world. That is the true abundance. And God Almighty should bless each person to see this and to be able to approach us with joy and do everything possible to increase the standing and the stature of human beings in the world, recognizing that by doing so, they're actually bringing more and more recognition and more gloriousness of God Almighty in the world, and to encourage every single human being to follow what follows naturally from being in a state of clarity, in a state of tranquility, in a state of joy, which is to bring more children into the world with an open heart and a joyous heart. And that, my friends, is the opportunity that we have. And of course, all those children will then be raised up lovingly in the knowledge, with parents who are tranquil and parents who are calm, and parents who know and trust in God Almighty's abundance, and teach their children according to God Almighty's divine loving guidance of the Torah's commandments for every single human being. And that will be a world of complete peace, a world of complete abundance, a world of complete health, a world of complete cooperation among people to serve God Almighty with one shoulder, and the complete speaking of the language of clarity of the holy tongue, that every single human being is going to be on the same page and in the same state of mind in the service of God Almighty. This is what the prophets have prophesied for. This is what the entire humanity has longed for and worked for. And we are in the final moments of the transition into that reality. And all that remains for us to do is to just open our eyes and see that it's really here already. It's only our confused last thoughts that we somehow out of habit hold on to, and insisting that things must be difficult, things must be complex, things must be hidden, things must be beyond reach. On the contrary, if we let go of that stuck thinking and that habitual thinking, and instead just embrace the reality that there's nothing besides God Almighty, that in itself is the realization and the fulfillment of the state of mind that will become the state of the world, and become a permanent state of the world with the coming of Mashiach and the redemption, the complete and true redemption right now. Everyone should have a good Shabbos and a freilichen Contagious Adar, and we should see you all soon, because we continue to learn the oneness of God, but God's loving kindness, God Almighty's loving kindness for every single person, and we bring this message of hope and joy to every single human being. Shabbos and a Contagious.